You woke up every morning at 5, put on the same uniform, and drove the same 40-minute route to a job you had held for 19 years. You never missed a shift. You never asked for a raise you didn't think you had earned yet. You believed the way you were taught that if you worked hard enough and long enough, the money would eventually follow. What you didn't know on that ordinary Tuesday morning was that the belief you had built your entire life around was about to be tested in a way you never saw coming. And by the end of that year, you would understand something about hard work that no one had ever bothered to explain to you. Before we go further, we have to ask the questions that make this story worth telling. Why does someone who works harder than almost everyone around them end up further behind than people who work half as much? Why does the system that promised you security seem to reward everyone except you? And what is the one thing some people discover, almost by accident, that changes the entire trajectory of their life? To understand any of that, we have to go back to where it all started. By the end of this video, you will know exactly what that one thing is. Not a theory, not a motivational idea, but the actual mechanism that separates the people who stay stuck from the people who quietly get ahead. And once you hear it, you will not be able to look at your own paycheck the same way again. You grew up in a house where money was talked about only in whispers. Your father worked the same job for over 3 decades and retired with a pension that barely covered the mortgage. Your mother took on extra work on the weekends just to help cover what the pension couldn't. You remember being young and watching your father come home exhausted, proud, and still broke. It was your father who first told you the words that would shape the next 2 decades of your life. Work hard, keep your head down, and everything else will take care of itself. You believed it completely. You never questioned it, not once, not even when the math stopped adding up. By the time you were in your early 20s, you had already started working the kind of job that promised stability if nothing else. You showed up early. You stayed late without being asked. You turned down time off more than once because the job needed you during a busy stretch. Every year, someone above you said the same thing. Keep doing what you're doing and it will pay off eventually. You held on to that sentence the way some people hold on to a promise, repeating it to yourself during the hardest weeks, the missed moments, the time spent catching up instead of living. For years, this rhythm felt like proof that things were working. Every raise, however small, felt like evidence that the plan was still on track. You told yourself that patience was the price of stability, and stability was worth more than speed. You watched coworkers change jobs every couple of years, chasing higher titles and bigger salaries, and you judged them quietly for not understanding loyalty the way you did. You believed the slow and steady path was the responsible one. You believed that anyone cutting corners would eventually pay for it. What you didn't realize was that the corners they were cutting weren't the ones you thought. Then came the year everything shifted. It didn't happen all at once. It happened in small moments that on their own seemed forgettable. A coworker who joined 2 years after you got promoted passed you. A friend from high school, someone who barely finished college, bought a second property while you were still renting. A cousin who never seemed to work more than 30 hours a week suddenly stopped talking about money problems altogether. Each of these moments felt like an exception, an anomaly, something you could explain away, but they kept happening. And slowly, a question you had never let yourself ask began to surface. What if hard work was never the variable that mattered most? You started paying closer attention, not out of ambition but out of confusion. You began noticing a pattern in the people who seemed to be moving ahead while working less than you. It wasn't that they were smarter. It wasn't that they were luckier, at least not in the way you had always assumed luck worked. It was that they were doing something fundamentally different with their time and their money, something you had never been taught and had never thought to ask about. You had spent your whole life optimizing for effort. They had spent theirs optimizing for ownership. That distinction, small as it sounds, was the beginning of everything. You started reading. Not self-help, not motivational content, but the actual mechanics of how money moves once it leaves a paycheck. You learned that a dollar earned from labor is taxed and spent differently than a dollar earned from an asset. You learned that the wealthy weren't avoiding work. They were avoiding trading time directly for money, because time is the one resource that never scales. You realized that every hour you worked only paid you once, while a dollar invested could keep paying you indefinitely, quietly in the background, whether you were awake or asleep. The more you learned, the more unsettling the past started to look. You thought about your father, who had given the plant 31 years of his life and walked away with a pension that couldn't keep pace with inflation. You thought about every year you had turned down a vacation, believing it was a sacrifice that would eventually be rewarded. You realized that the sacrifice had been real, but the reward had never been guaranteed. It had never even been likely. The people who built lasting wealth weren't working harder than you. In most cases, they were working less, but on different things entirely. Before we go further, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. What came next was the hardest part. It wasn't the discovery itself that hurt. It was the realization of how much time had already passed. You began to understand that the story you had been told about hard work wasn't entirely false, but it was incomplete in a way that mattered enormously. Hard work builds skill. It builds reputation. It can even build income. But on its own, without ownership, without leverage, without assets working alongside you, hard work simply builds more hard work. It creates a ceiling that feels invisible until you've spent a decade running into it. You started to see the pattern everywhere once you knew what you were looking for. The people who seemed to escape the grind weren't smarter or more talented. They had simply stopped believing that their hours were the only thing they had to sell. Some had started small businesses that didn't require their constant presence. Others had put money into assets early, even small amounts, and let time compound quietly while they kept working their regular jobs. None of it required extraordinary luck. It required a piece of information that somehow never made it into the version of hard work you were taught to believe in. This is the part of the story that stings the most if you let it. It wasn't a conspiracy. No one sat in a room and decided to keep this information from you specifically. It was simpler and in some ways more frustrating than that. The people who benefit from a workforce that believes ours are the only path to security have very little incentive to teach a different lesson. A workforce that keeps showing up, keeps staying late, keeps believing that the next raise is just around the corner is a stable and predictable one. Asking questions about ownership was never part of the curriculum, not because it was hidden but because no one profited from teaching it to you. Once you saw this clearly, you couldn't unsee it. You started making small changes, nothing dramatic, nothing that would have made a good headline. You began setting aside a portion of every paycheck before you saw it, redirecting it towards something that could grow without requiring more of your hours. You started reading about the difference between a job and an asset, and you began treating your income less like an endpoint and more like a starting point. It didn't fix everything overnight. It didn't erase the years already spent. But it changed the direction you were moving in, and for the first time that direction wasn't a straight line toward exhaustion. Looking back now, you don't blame the version of yourself who believed in hard work alone. That version of you was doing exactly what he was taught to do with the information he had. The problem was never effort. The problem was that effort was sold to you as the whole strategy, when it was only ever meant to be the beginning of one. The years you gave weren't wasted, but they weren't enough on their own, and no one ever sat you down to explain why. So here is the question worth sitting with long after this video ends. If hard work alone was never the missing piece, how many years have you already spent believing it was? And if you knew now what took years to learn, would you still be waiting for the raise, or would you already be looking somewhere else?